than 4 decades in sports journalism, working for the Boston Herald and the New York Post. He spent much of his early career covering hockey before moving on to baseball and college sports. He's now a freelancer in the Boston area and spent the past 15 years as an official scorer at Fenway Park, which is just really cool. Shalin is the author of Donnie Baseball, the definitive biography of Don Mattingly, as well as several books for young readers. He's also the co-author of Out by a Step, the 100 Best Players Not in the Baseball Hall of Fame, and Tales from the New York Rangers Locker Room. Tonight he's going to present his book, Hometown Team, 4 Decades of Red Sox Photography, which he wrote alongside the photographs of veteran sports photographer Steve Babineau. From star and support players to members of the grounds crew, Red Sox staff, alumni, and some opposing players, this book features Fenway's most memorable characters from the past 40 years, with behind-the-scenes images of the ballpark during that time as well. Thank you so much, Mike, for coming tonight.
I don't need a podium. Hi, how is everybody? I've got friends, I've got relatives here. First of all, I'd like to introduce 2 celebrity members of the Fenway Park family. This is Mr. Bob Ellis, who is one of the other 2 official scorers along with me, and this is Larry Haber, who is in part of the MLB crew that charts all the pitches and the pertinent statistics during the game, and he's there basically to bug me. So, yes.
That's not the same Bob Ellis that does the Riverhawks.
Yes, it is. The voice of the Riverhawks. It's the voice of the Riverhawks. And how many years you been doing the scoring?
Is it the hometown announcers run?
The
Is it the hometown announcers run?
no. How many years scoring? 10? At Fenway? 17? No, that's longer than me.
Yes.
You were there before I was?
Yes.
Okay.
It wasn't,
But you were interrupted.
but it was a little bit of an interruption.
Yeah.
But it was also initially just a few games a year, 3 this year, a year, and maybe 2 that year.
Well, he's been there longer than I have. So,
And I'll also say, since they mentioned hockey, 35.
35 years and he's the only man I know who literally can do PA announcing without a microphone. We call it the dulcet tones of Bob Ellis. Also, welcome to the viewers on Chelmsford Cable. It's nice to be wired up and not being involved in any kind of a criminal investigation. This book, unfortunately, Steve was supposed to be with me tonight, but Steve, and he would have brought his championship rings. Steve is still a photographer, the official photographer of the Bruins, and they decided to play a scrimmage tonight because of their long layoff. So Steve is at the Garden shooting, and if he would have been here, I could have taken the night off, because basically what I do is I turn it over to him, and then by the time he gets through his 6th grade taking pictures, everybody's asleep and we can leave, we can go home. But no, really, he has got some great stories, and he's very proud of the fact that until recently, he had 1 more championship ring than Tom Brady. Because he had 6, Brady had 5. Now Brady's got 6, and Steve's going to get a 7th in about 10 days or 12 days or whatever. So he is, this book, as you see, the cover of this book, I love to talk about the cover because Steve's a different kind of photographer. Steve does not go for the standard, the standard shots. Before this game, now the significance of this cover is that this is the only time since 1918 that the Red Sox won the World Series at Fenway Park. So before the game, they had a photographer's meeting and asked, where would you like to be? So all the other guys, they want to be by home plate, by first base. Steve said, no, I want to be out in left field. What do you mean? I want to be out in left field. So now he's out there by himself. Now, if you remember this play, it was a 3-run double, and that's Jacoby Ellsbury, Bogarts and Ortiz behind home plate, Johnny Gomes sliding into home plate, and Steve is right off the monster at this point. taking this shot. Now, had he gone with the other guys, what would he have gotten? Right? A lot of backsides, right? And then there's a picture like 3 or 4 pages into the book of them pouring out of the dugout, and Steve was actually on the Green Monster. So anyway, the way this all came about was we would both show up early for Bruins games, and he'd ask me about, he'd say, I've got thousands upon thousands of pictures and slides, because you remember there was a thing called film, remember film and cameras? I've got boxes and boxes of these things, and he had done a book called Black and Gold, which was the Bruins equivalent of this book. And so we started talking back and forth, and I said, well, you know, sure, why not? You know, and the standard joke I tell, or standard line, is that he kept bugging me and bugging me and bugging me, and when the restraining order didn't work, I decided to do the book with him. So I got in touch with the publisher, and we decided to do the book, and he would be going through boxes of these slides and photos, and he would send me emails, you know, I found Bob Stanley, I found this guy, I found Freddie Lynn, I found this, I found that. And my job was to contact as many people as I could, because I had covered the team as a beat writer from 1983 through 1995. So a lot of the guys from the 80s were not only the guys I covered, but guys I didn't always get along well with, you know, because the baseball players are very touchy. They don't like things like statistics to go into stories, and you know, they kind of get mad at you. And Bruce Hurst is a classic example. He and I had our battles. Bobby Ojeda once, in fact, I was in Florida covering Wade Boggs' mom's funeral, and I got a call. Again, there was these were real phones. You had to hold them like this and stuff. But I got a call from the late great Larry Whiteside. He was one of my counterparts at the Globe, and he says, Mike, he says, you got to get back here. I said, why? He said, because Ojeda's got a sign on his locker saying, Shalin kissed my ass. And I said, why? You know, because one thing I learned in this business is when you expect to get yelled at, you don't, and when you don't expect it, you get yelled at. And so I had written a story. Back then, in the 80s, the Red Sox had the 3 righty starters, Clemens, Nipper, Oil Can, and the 2 lefty starters, Ojeda and Hurst. So I had written a story saying that the 2 lefties had combined for 2 wins in the last 8 weeks, or whatever it was. So when I got back, I went over to Bobby, and the thing is still hanging there, and I said, what's that about? And Ojeda said, well, you can write what you want on Herald stationery, and I'll write what I want on Red Sox stationery. So I said, okay, now tell me what you're mad about. He said, yeah, why do you gotta lump us together? Why do you gotta lump us together? And there's Hurst standing right there, and Bruce had kind of a whiny voice, and he like looked down. He said, yeah, why do you gotta lump us together? We're not joined at the hip. And it was like they were a singing group. You know, the 2 of them were ganging up on me. And fast forward to spring training the next year, I arrive in Orlando. I never forget this because I had my cat with me in a carrier. I was at the rental car counter, and along comes Bobby Ojeda and a pitcher named Mike Brown, which you probably all remember. And we start just saying hello and shooting the BS and stuff. And I said to Bobby, I said, I thought you're not talking to me. He says, oh, that was last year. So this is the kind of stuff that you have to live with as a writer. Dan Shaughnessy certainly lives with it from the Globe, and Dick Young in New York was one of my mentors, and Dick was always in trouble, but he taught me one thing that I've remembered to this day, and this is 40 years ago. Whenever you write something negative, you show up the next day. Whether you're working or not, you show up the next day. And Dan Shaughnessy does this better than anybody, because Dan will come up and he'll not only show up, but he'll stick his face right in somebody's face, and just, because the chances are they're not going to hit you. You know, I've never been struck by an athlete. But anyway, talking about these guys that I didn't always get along with, there were guys that I did, but I got Hurst on the phone, and it was like he found a lost relative. You know, I have a cousin sitting here now that I didn't even know I had until 2 years ago, and You know, it was like the Patty Duke thing, you know. We were not identical by any means, but I got Hurst on, I couldn't get him off the phone, you know, and it was like, I could see, and Bruce Hurst is a guy who, you'll read, if you do buy a book later, shameless plug, if you buy a book later, you will see that Hurst left his baseball career behind him. He really, in fact, at one point, he called it my so-called career. And I said, Bruce, you were a pretty darn good pitcher. And, you know, he just said, well, that was a different chapter in his life. And he regrets leaving Boston. That's the biggest regret he's ever had in his life. And he said that he's waiting to pitch his first game in San Diego because of the time difference. He's in the clubhouse, and the Red Sox are on television. So there's all his buddies on television, and he said it was the weirdest feeling, and he knew as soon as he took the mound in San Diego that things were different. And we know that things are different in Boston and New York and places like that, but mostly Boston and New York. And there were guys in that era. The only picture of me in that book is a picture of me and Jim Rice that Steve took 2 seasons ago. And I've had an interesting journey with Jim along the way. People always had this label of Jim that he was a hard ass. He was tough to talk to after games. It was always my feeling that if the Red Sox won, you didn't talk to Jim Rice. If the Red Sox lost, you went and talked to Jim Rice because he was very analytical and he was always willing to talk about what went wrong. Now, we were fine. We never had a problem. And then all of a sudden, we're in Cleveland one night, and one of the baseball umpires had died, and I was going around the room just getting reaction from the players. And all of a sudden, Jim says to me, I ain't talking to you no more. And I said, why? Again, no idea. He says, well, you put my salary in the paper and somebody tried to steal my kid from the schoolyard. And I said, well, first of all, I'm sorry that happened. But second of all, your salary's in the paper every day. He was the highest paid player in the game at the time. So it was just a bizarre thing, because what happened was back then, I had tremendous labor contacts. And in fact, I had everybody's contract in my desk at home. I was one of maybe 4 or 5 writers who were that connected. So there was I think it was 85, there was a strike for like 3 days, or 2 or 3 days, but it was coming. So we decided, we did something in the Herald, what each Red Sox player stands to lose per day if there's a strike. And naturally, his salary was in there. So he credited me with his kid almost getting stolen out of the schoolyard. So as we're sitting there arguing about this, Dwight Evans walks by and looks down and he says, yeah, why you got to put our salaries in the paper for? Everybody knows how much we make. And I just kind of looked, and the long and short of that story was Jim didn't talk to me for 7 years. But then he found out I was voting for him for the Hall of Fame, which I've been a voter since 1989. So now we're best buddies. Now Dewey, we've come far enough to where he wrote one of the forwards in this book. And Dewey, unfortunately, just lost one of his sons, just passed away. But it's interesting how you go through relationships with these guys. I remember having dinner with Marty Barrett and his wife a few years ago in Las Vegas. Marty was one of the great guys I ever covered. And I said to him at dinner, I said, Marty, you're one of about 4 or 5 people I've ever covered that I'd want to have dinner with. And he was very flattered by that. He picked up the check, which I thought was great too. But as far as this book is concerned, we've gotten some very good reactions. There's 500 pictures in that book, and the only missing picture in there was the book actually came out last year, and Steve and I were here, not in Chelmsford, but we were in Massachusetts, and the publisher's in New York. So we're sending them the pictures and trusting them to lay these out. And the only thing that got messed up was at the last minute, he sent pictures of Alex Cora, who had just been hired as a manager, and they didn't put them in. Otherwise, the book to me is timeless, and let's be honest, the Red Sox didn't hurt us at all when they won another World Series last year, because you like that for book sales. Either like that or some sort of scandal. Speaking of scandals, I like to bring up Wade Boggs. I can confidently say that I'm the only sports writer to appear on the Geraldo show to talk about Wade Boggs' sex life, which was more than an interesting day. I don't know if you recall, but Wade had his thing with Margot Adams, and then he was in a charity softball game down south, and I think it was Mike Lynch, one of those guys, Mike Dowling, was interviewing him. He said he saw this show about sex addiction on Geraldo. They said, that's what I got. So naturally, the Geraldo people wanted to do another show on sex addiction. So they called me because I was writing all the stories about Wade and Margot and getting, I remember sitting outside Margot's lawyer's office one day. There was a bunch of us out in Irvine, California, and Wade came out of the depositions, and TV cameras all over the place, and Wade says, I just spent 2.5 hours getting them to spell your name right. I said, my name? Believe me, it had something to do with a cake recipe. Then Margot said, we were so close that he gave me his mother's cake recipe for cherry upside down cake or whatever it was, I don't know. But I go and I do this thing in New York, which was a very interesting day. They sent a plane ticket for me. They sent the car that they sent to pick me up at the airport was a station wagon. So it was really high level stuff. And I got through that, but my odyssey with Wade just never ended. There was a situation where he was involved in an incident he was at a fishing tournament in Tallahassee. And supposedly a guy got into his car and put a knife to his throat. And so I go on radio the next night, and I said to the host, Dick Lutz, I believe was the host, and I said, Dick, anytime Wade is involved in an incident in a bar, there's going to be speculation that there was a woman involved. Now, unbeknownst to me, there was a quote from a sheriff in the newspaper, quote, there was a woman involved. Okay. So I get home, my phone's ringing. It's Wade calling from Florida. Again, no cell phones, so there's always, black holes. You can't call people whenever you want. He's calling from Florida, screaming at me. How can you say that? My daughter's up there visiting friends, and she has to hear this stuff, and and he's screaming at me. And finally, he hangs up on me. So I call back, and his wife answers the phone. I said, where is he? She said, he's out on the porch cooling off. I said, well, get him back on the phone. This can't end like this. Just essentially, I was writing his side of that whole drama as it was going on and on. Heck, I was on the Geraldo show. So he comes back on the phone, and I said, listen, if I was out to get you, I could have done it a long time ago. I said, I've been the one writing your side of this story. You held it out. I actually held it for him at one point for a month. Now, I said, he said, well, yeah, he's grumbling. I said, why don't you tell me what happened? Now, I knew I wasn't going to get the whole story, but he just fast-forwarded right to the thing about the guy getting into his vehicle, and he put a knife to my throat. I said, oh, wow. I said, what'd you do? And I can't remember if it was Bruce Lee or one of those people, but he said that he saw in a movie where so-and-so willed himself invisible. And that's what I did. And now there's a pause on my end of the phone. If I was on a situation comedy, the camera would have been on me like Kenan Thompson. I'll never forget this. I said, you want me to write that? And he says, yeah, that's what happened. So, okay. So the next day in the Herald, Boggs, I willed myself invisible. Now, he leaves the Red Sox and goes to the Yankees. think it was still Fort Lauderdale then. When he reports to the Yankee spring training, the New York writers jump him immediately. Wade, tell us about your 11 years in Boston. I was never in Boston. So the writers, who were well aware of what I had written the year before, said, the man who willed himself invisible now says he was invisible for the last 11 years. What, 7 batting titles or whatever the hell it was. And that was my life with Wade. Everything just, I could write a book just on my dealings with Wade Boggs. Great hitter though, man, he could hit. But I did cover the Yankees for 2 years. Mr. Ellis here is a huge Yankee fan. And covering George Steinbrenner, see, these guys and gals today have it tough because they have the social media, so they have to do everything right away. Everything's, you know, that's the 4th time the guy's grounded out to shortstop, like we can't, you know. But anyway, but covering George, to me, was like the life of an air traffic controller. 2 years, 3 years, then you start to burn out, you know. I mean, it's just 24 hours a day, and thank God there were no cell phones because that would have just made it ridiculous. But my favorite George story, there are many, but the one that involved me was they had lost a doubleheader one night. It was a twilight doubleheader, and I'm sitting there. We're still on typewriters. You know, I like to ask when young kids are at the thing, you know what a typewriter is? So I'm sitting there typing my story, and the PR guy comes down and says, Mike, George wants to see you in his office. Okay, I can, you know, that's fine. I finish my story. We send it in. Now I go upstairs, and I go into George's office, and it's kind of dark, like that scene from The Natural, you know, where the shades are kind of half open or whatever. I walk in, and he goes, Mike, sit down. Okay. Now, preface this by saying now, the Yankees used to change pitching coaches and batting coaches like we change our socks. I think it was 5-3 that year or whatever. He says, Mike, sit down. So I sit down. He says, Mike, you know pitching. Okay. Now I'm thinking, is he crazy enough to ask a sports writer to be his pitching coach? Is that possible? I mean, let's put it this way, is it impossible? So I said, yeah. He says, you know pitching, tell me what's wrong with Goose. And I had noticed that Gossage had put on a few pounds, and at the time, the Yankees had a pitcher named Rick Russell, who was an outstanding pitcher, but kind of made CC Sabathia look like a workout freak. I mean, Rick was a big man. And I said to George, I said, well, for one thing, he kind of looks like Russell. So George slammed his hand on the desk and said, I said that. I marched into that trainer's room and I told Monahan, he loses 10 pounds in 2 weeks or you're fired. You can't make it up. You can't write it, because there was a game in spring training. The Yankees had signed a guy named Tucker Ashford. Tucker Ashford was a one-time bonus baby, but never made it. Montreal, San Diego. The Yankees bring him in, he gets to camp, and he gets the mumps, of all things. Doesn't play for the first 3 weeks. Goes out and plays third base, 2 errors in the first inning of his first game. So when you covered the Yankees, you covered the game with one eye and George with the other. Whether he's on that side or that side, you had to know where he was. So we timed it. We saw him leaving his box, and we got there just in time for him to say, well, we've looked at Tucker Ashford. And that was the end of Tucker Ashford, never to be seen again. That's just the way it was, you know. And so I moved to Boston after 3 years of doing that, thinking, all right, I've had enough of this stuff. I'm going to go to a place where it's a little calmer, a little more laid back. And I get there, I must have been on the beat. First of all, I had 3 different fights with Ralph Houck in spring training. But it's several weeks into the season, and it's Tony Conigliaro night at Fenway Park. And I walk into Fenway and find out that Buddy LaRue had staged a coup to take over the ownership of the team. Like, wait a minute, this isn't supposed to happen here. So that was how I got to the laid-back Red Sox. Got to 95, I stopped covering the team. So in 03, I was covering Boston College football and basketball, and I started scoring, official scoring. I was a scorer in Game 4 of the ALCS in 2004, where the greatest relief pitcher of all time, who never walked anybody, walked a batter who never walked, and then out of the dugout comes Dave Roberts, and everybody east of the Mississippi knew that Dave Roberts was going to be running. Posada, who never had a great arm, made maybe the best throw he's ever made. That much, and you know what happened after that. In fact, before the game, there were stories that the Red Sox had given up 19 runs the night before. Before the game, there were stories that Red Sox players were wishing the Yankees well in the World Series. Go get them, because nobody had ever come back from 3-0 before then. And, well, we saw what happened. So I scored in 4, 7, 13. It's been fun. The Hall of Fame is something that comes with, when you're on the beat for 10 years, you become a Hall of Fame voter, and it used to be forever, but now they've kind of cut that back, but I'm still voting, and the two most interesting things that come up with the Hall, one is Pete Rose, and the other is the steroid guys, obviously. I was there in New York when Pete met with John Dowd, who has gone on to become one of the 2 weak lawyers that the current president's had. But he was in charge of the investigation. So Pete goes into the office, and John Dowd's got a stack of betting slips this big with Pete's handwriting. Pete, we got you, okay? And here's what we're going to do. We're going to suspend you from baseball for life. You're going to go away, you're going to be a good boy, and you're going to come back in 2-3 years, try to get reinstated, keep your nose clean, everything, blah, blah, blah. Now, Pete's contention has always been, I never bet against my team. Well, if you got a 3-game series in Cincinnati, and Pete bets on the Reds the first night, okay? Pete bets on the Reds the second night, all right? The third night, his pitcher maybe has a little bit of a twinge in his elbow. So Pete doesn't bet on anybody. That's the same as betting on the other team as far as the bookies are concerned. So that was the inherent danger here. So they make a plea deal. Like I say, it happens in the courts all the time. You plead to a lesser charge, you get lesser debt, blah, blah. So Pete accepts the deal, they shake hands, and the writers were all outside the office. And Pete emerges from the meeting and says, they got nothing on me. And he became a victim. Never to admit what he did until he had a book to sell. One thing I hate is people trying to sell books. It's just awful. It's not a good thing. But fast forward to the steroid guys. I originally did not vote for Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, but I just decided that until somebody can come up with actual statistics on the percentage of the batters that Clemens faced and the percentage of the pitchers that Bonds hit against, who was on what, and the estimates are as high as 80 to 85% of all players in that era were on something. So now not only am I voting for those two, but I'm going to have room next year. I'm going to vote for Manny Ramirez because he's still the best right-handed hitter I've ever been around. And but I understand the other side of the feeling about that, not voting for them. But I've maintained all along that the Hall of Fame has been the greatest loser in this whole steroid thing because everybody is suspect. I mean, Piazza's in and everybody thought he was on. Bagwell's in, everybody thought he was on. I did have one interesting thing happen. The year before Craig Biggio got in, he was 2 votes shy of getting in. And it was 2 guys from New York who said, one of them just passed away, Marty Noble, who said that they didn't vote for him because of suspicions of steroids. Okay. So now I'm driving on the Mass Pike. I'm heading out to UMass to cover a basketball game, and Jim Bowden and Casey Stern are on the radio talking about this. And so I called the producer, and I said, I'm a voter from Boston, and I didn't vote for Craig Biggio, but it had nothing to do with steroids. So the guy says, wow, will you come on the air? Will you come on the air? Now here I am doing 70 miles an hour on the Mass Pike, you know. So, will you come on the air? Would you come on? Sure, you know, what the heck. So I get on the air, and Bowden, former general manager, says, Mike, I've got your ballot here in front of me. Now, we had just signed a waiver saying that they can release our ballots 2 weeks from now. So I don't know how he had my ballot. But he says, I see you voted for Don Mattingly. I said, yeah, I did. And he said, well, didn't you write a book with Don Mattingly? And I said, yeah, I did. And in fact, I didn't vote for Mattingly the first time through until I wrote the chapter on Kirby Puckett in our Best Players Not in the Hall of Fame. And Mattingly was in the book, but their stats are very similar. Now, Kirby won 2 championships. Mattingly didn't win any. So I said, yeah, I did vote for Don Mattingly. He said, well, don't you see that as a problem? I said, let me ask you, now I'm up to 75 miles an hour, because now I'm getting mad. And I said, let me ask you a question. I said, was there ever a time that Craig Biggio was considered the best player in baseball? What do you mean? I said, well, no, just like, was he ever talked about as one of the best players in baseball? Well, no. I said, well, there's a 3 or 4 year period where Don Mattingly was the best player in baseball, offensively, defensively, whatever. Shut him up pretty good. So that was, I got back down to 70, everybody was happy, and we got on with it. But the Hall of Fame, you know, I don't want to use the word honor, because I guess it's an honor. It really is. And I got to cover the induction several years in a row, probably 12 or 13. And I was in Cooperstown one night, and I was actually staying in Oneonta right next door. And I saw in the paper that Pete Rose Jr. was in town with the Phillies minor league team. And I looked out my hotel window and I saw the ballpark. The lights were on. So I said, you know, so I left the wife and kids and scooted on over to the ballpark. You know, you never strike out unless you swing. And like Wayne Gretzky said, 100% of the shots you don't take are not going to be goals. So I get out of my car, and they're unloading the bus. There's 2 guys unloading the bus, and one of them is Pete Rose Jr. So I go over to him, and I introduce myself. Talks to me for 10 or 15 minutes about his dad. Then I go in, and if you remember Bobby Tolan, who used to be an outfielder, he was his manager. And Tolan was livid at me for talking to Pete Rose. So what do you want me to do? I got out of my car. I almost tripped over the guy. What do you want me to do? Not ask him a question? Well, okay. So some of the greatest stories you ever get, you have no business getting, and some of the greatest ones you miss, you have no business missing. But it's been a long, the '86 World Series, we know what happened there, obviously. My mother, I grew up 3 miles from Shea Stadium, and my mother was paid $400 by the Boston Herald to use our basement as a darkroom because the film had to be bicycle messenger back and forth to Shea Stadium, about 2 or 3 miles away. So my mom got friendly with the Herald guys, and obviously she was a Met fan, and they were rooting for the Red Sox. And the night the ball goes through Buckner's legs, the headline the next day of the New York Daily News was, "We ain't dead yet." So what does my mother do? She cuts it out, and she pastes it to the front door for when the guys show up on the next morning to go to work. Now, if you remember, Game 7 was rained out, and Oil Can was supposed to pitch. That his being skipped over turned out to be the lead entry, and I did his autobiography with him a few years ago, about how he heard from McNamara he wasn't pitching, he got upset, he left the hotel, he went to buy drugs and all this stuff. But Game 7 was rained out, and I had to close on a house on Monday morning. So if you remember Eastern Airlines, back in the day, the shuttle, they were running a $19 fare for anybody who had a ticket to the game or a credential. So I went to LaGuardia in the morning, flew up to Boston, got picked up, drove to Salem, closed on the house, back to the airport, back to New York, and covered Game 7 of the World Series. Now, Game 6, me and probably, I don't know, 99 other writers, 50 in each clubhouse, never saw what happened. Because we were waiting outside the clubhouse because the game, there was 2 out, nobody on. I go downstairs, and we're all standing outside the Met clubhouse, and guys are walking in. There's Hernandez comes walking in, and according to reports, took off his uniform pants, lit a cigarette, and sat in the manager's office with his feet up on the desk. And all of a sudden, a cop had a transistor radio, but we really couldn't hear what was going on. We just heard the crowd. So really, when they came off, I didn't know, you kind of didn't know what happened. So you kind of like going around asking guys, and you don't know what you're asking them. And it reminded me, the great Bob Prince, who was the longtime voice of the Pittsburgh Pirates. 1960, you remember this, Bob?
Oh, yeah.
1960, he's the voice of the Pirates. Mel Allen is the voice of the Yankees, and back then they used to have one announcer from each team. So I was doing a story, 1980, I was doing a 20-year anniversary of the 60 Pirates, and I got Prince on the phone. I said, now, tell me about what that was like, you know? And Prince said in his gruff, gravel voice, he said, I never saw the son of a bitch. I said, what? He said, yeah, he says, I'm doing the game with Mel Allen, and we're ahead by a run, and they tell me to get downstairs to the clubhouse, and I go into the clubhouse, and Elroy Face is praying. I said, what's the matter, Elroy? He said, the Yankees got first and third, nobody out. And somebody yells, Yankees tie it, get back upstairs. So he says, I run out, and I get back up, and there was a walkway up to the back of the press box in Forbes Field. I get up, and I put my hand on the knob, and I hear a big roar. Somebody yells, Pirates win, get back downstairs. So I run downstairs, he says, and the place is going crazy. First guy in the clubhouse I grab is Mazeroski. I said, how's it feel to be a member of the world champion Pirates? He says, great. I kissed him off and went on to the next guy. Which is essentially now, in '86, I never saw that whole inning until 8 years later when Sports Channel actually played the game over. I'd never seen the entire inning. But it was fun to be there for that. I was there for the Kirk Gibson homer. I was there for the Joe Carter homer. Seen a lot. And right now, I'm enjoying scoring, and I also work for the Connecticut Sun of the WNBA on their stat crew, and I write a column for the Union Leader up in Manchester 3 days a week. So, and I talk to people in libraries, even though some of them leave. But anyway, does anybody have any questions before we get people on the road? No questions? You guys, I was counting on you guys for questions.
You said something that did pique my interest. Noting that you find stories where you least expect it, and some of your best stories come almost walking, running into a guy in a parking lot. What are the ones you missed that you wished you'd been there for?
Oh, without a doubt, the earthquake in
San Francisco?
my middle son was born September 27th. So I was off, and I didn't go to the World Series. And the people who covered that, you know, thank goodness nobody got hurt, but that's a one-in-a-lifetime thing. Now, the converse to that is that I covered the miracle of Lake Placid for United Press International. So which I feel still to this day is the greatest thing that's ever happened in sports. The most incredible thing that's ever happened is those college kids beating those Ruskies. It was a time where the there was tension between the two countries,
The Cold War was
as opposed now to where they seem to be in bed together. But, but yeah, I would say I would have to go with that. Missing that one. Oh, I missed my share. You know, I mean, I worked for a long time opposite Nick Cafardo, who we just lost, and we used to we used to, like, back then when Lou Gorman was the general manager, you got to talk to Lou every day, basically. Then Dan Duquette came along and changed everything. But the problem with Lou is that he had a touch of narcolepsy and would literally fall asleep at his desk. And he had a drawer full of chocolate that he would eat for the sugar, you know. But the problem was, you would get something from Lou. I would reach him at 4 or 4:15, thinking I was going to file a really decent story. But by the time Nick spoke to him at 5, it was a whole different world because he had already nodded off or whatever. So that was a little bit of a fear thing because you never knew what was going to come out the next day. But by and large, you know, my oil can experience was a highlight of my career. I loved working with him on the book. I also was the person who asked him the question in Cleveland that time when he said that's what happens when you build a ballpark next to an ocean, which was great. But met a lot of great people over the year. Johnny Pesky, man that I loved dearly, and saw the way the players loved him. The Pawtucket people. I remember being a New York writer, covering the 33rd inning of the longest game ever played. Drove up from New York to cover that. Covering Dave Righetti pitching against Mark Fidrich at Pawtucket. Covering Dave Righetti's no-hitter against the Red Sox, which I don't think I've ever seen Wade Boggs look that bad on a pitch, almost like he wanted him to finish the no-hitter. But it's been fun. Been a lot of fun. Yeah.
curious. Jim Fregosi, I think when managing the Phillies at one point, or in Philadelphia, said New York, Boston, Philadelphia were the toughest places to manage or play baseball. You've worked as a reporter in both New York and Boston. Are there more similarities between the media or more differences, New York versus Boston?
Well, like Dale Barrow once said about his father, even our similarities are different.
And what about his father?
Yeah, he. I think that in its own way, Boston's tougher, but in its own way, Boston is more rooting. I've always sensed. See, I've always felt that the rivalry is more important to Boston than it is to New York, and I think that stems from Broadway, the financial, the whole thing about being New York's little brother. And New York has multiple teams. You know, I mean, starting with the 3 baseballs at one time, which I can't even imagine what that was like. But yes, I am. And I'm not younger than many people, which is a good thing. Did you have a question, Mr. Haber?
I did. I wanted to know the craziest play you've ever seen, and also I want to know the play that stands out that you think you've ever seen. The craziest and one that.
No. The craziest play I've ever seen. Oh my gosh. There's been a lot of those. As a scorer, we're constantly seeing things we've never seen before. Yeah, and that's the one thing about baseball. The greatest, I'll tell you, that catch Bradley made on Judge was as good as I've seen. I think that was better than the Willie Mays catch in 1954, to be honest. I think the one he made in left center field last year too. See, I didn't think the one he made in Baltimore this year was even in his top 5, in my opinion, because he just does that. You know, he doesn't hit, but that's what he's a great field. I don't know about crazy. I don't know about crazy plays. I'm trying to remember. I don't. You got me on that one. I'll have to get back to you. You'll have to come to my next gathering, either that or at Fenway Park. Anybody else? Yes.
Are there any players that you sort of saw when they played in not in the, I'm sorry, in the various leagues we had before you guys hit the professional?
The minors.
You saw minors. You're like, oh, this guy's going to be awesome. And you knew from covering them earlier. Like Applebaum, I think. Didn't he pitch for like Portland or?
Yeah, but that works both ways, because we all thought Sam Horn was going to be a great slugger, and all he wound up to be is a website, Sons of Sam Horn. You get the scouting reports on these guys as they come along. Like, for instance, we knew Mo Vaughn was going to be a great hitter, and as soon as you saw him in the major leagues, you knew he was going to be a great hitter. But they don't always make it. Clemens came with a big amount of fanfare, obviously, and he was considerably thinner back then. But
We're getting such vets who certainly through the Red Sox farm system was thought as maybe an extra infielder, not really as become by imagination.
always considered a superb athlete. Didn't really have a position, which is odd now when you see him play the two outfield positions the way he does. But you just don't know, because what happens to some of these guys is they get hurt, and you see them, but then they're not. And then there's the guys that get to the big leagues and just can't, for whatever reason, they can't do it. And then you've got your guys like Al Nipper, who was a bulldog and a battler. For instance, Al Nipper would not allow the two Yankees to hit 19 home runs against his team like the Orioles did. Somebody would have been, on the ground. Anybody else? Why do you look familiar? Yeah.
I get that a lot.
In the well, Mike Greenwell, I think, made 62 errors as a third baseman in the low minor leagues before they made him an outfielder.
And volunteered to catch the ball.
Volunteered to catch and threw the game away. Threw the game away. Oakland was smart enough to bunt, and Mike Greenwell threw the ball down the right field line. Yeah. Yes.
Just curious how you feel about some of the rules that have been starting to speed us a game. Do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I think I like the three-batter thing, because somebody did a statistical thing that said there was only one guy in the major leagues last year who had more than 30 appearances to face one batter, and that was Blevins with the Mets. This thing about moving the mound back, I don't understand that. The pitch count is a farce, and the clock, because as soon as you throw to first, the clock starts again. Or as soon as you step off the rubber, the clock starts again. I've been around the game for 40 plus years, and I don't remember ever being in a baseball game where at least once I didn't say, my God, this is boring. It is by nature. I mean, that's what it is. The people who say, well, the greatest thing about it is it doesn't have a clock. You can sit on the beach and listen to the game, and you can do this. Okay, that's fine. Are the games too long? Probably. What they've done with pitchers, with the pitch count, you get to that 100 and better get him out of there before his arm falls off. And the problem is, most of their arms fall off. No matter what they do, they get hurt anyway. Sale last week, right? 17 strikeouts, 108 pitches. Now, Alex Cora didn't do anything wrong, because obviously Sale's numbers go down in August, September, and October. So that's what you're thinking about. This is May, big deal. And again, I credit Dan Shaughnessy with this, because I heard him say this, strikeouts aren't what they used to be. So when Tom Seaver struck out 20, that's different than Chris Sale striking out 20 in this era where everybody strikes out. Because everybody swings from the heels now. And everybody is shocked when there's a bunt with first and second. They're going to try to move the runners up. But, yeah.
I think the season's too long.
162.
162.
Well, the only talk about shortening it would be by 8 games. Is that going to matter? Because they used to play 154 before 1961.
But they also played double headers.
They played double headers. They had a lot more off days.
Travel.
Right.
And I think the question, again, correct, the question is not the number of games, but the calendar that's taken up from the opening day to the end of the World Series, which,
Yeah.
because of the many levels of players.
I can see that. I'd like to see them go back to playing double headers. But again, with double headers, you're dealing with the pitching problems. You get, first of all, I think rosters should be 28 all year anyway. I don't think they should expand on the 1st of September. If they do expand, I think you should have a 30-man roster and you have to designate 25 to play the game.
We should do the 28-man roster, designate 25.
No, let them have 28. Let them have 28, but put a limit on the pitchers. You know, if you're going to keep it at 25, my brother actually suggested this to me once. I told him he was drunk, but he wasn't. But if you got a backup catcher and he pinch hits, let him come back in the game later. What's the harm? And the thing is that every time we do something for the first time, you know, the worry is, like now you've got openers. I mean, you got the Tampa Bay thing. They had opener night with Stanek. They had bottle openers for Ryan Stanek. Well, how long do you think it's going to be before we can start awarding wins to those pitchers? I think it's going to happen. So what's going to happen is just treat it like, you know, 3. He went 3. That's all they asked him to do. Give him the win. Now everybody's going to say, well, what about all the other ones? Well, you can't fix the other ones.
And I believe the college baseball managers beforehand designated a relief game and treated it differently.
Yeah. I can live with that. Now, I should point out, while you're all here, that there's 3 of us that score at Fenway. Us 2 and Charlie Scoggin. Charlie's been doing it since Babe Ruth left Boston to go to New York. Yeah. But I am the only one of the 3 to escape unscathed against David Ortiz.
Okay.
Charlie got it. I was not scathed. Charlie got it in a pregame press conference where he was demanding an RBI, which he didn't deserve and he wound up getting. This guy, it was a day game at Fenway, the windows were open, and here's Poppy screaming at Bob in the 7th inning from the field. And I'm sitting there because I was covering the game for a wire service. I'm like, oh my God, this is embarrassing. And he was, but I escaped. The problem was, I was covering that game. So I had to go down to the clubhouse as a reporter with my tape recorder and stand there in front of Ortiz while he ripped official scoring. And I can't say anything because I'm not there in that capacity. But, and now we have a thing. It used to be that players could ask to speak to us after games to ask us about calls. Can't do that anymore. It's in the basic agreement. They're not allowed to talk to us. They have their agents file a complaint and whatever. And I'm very proud of the fact that last year the Boston scorers were 12-0 against appeals. 7-0 right here. So I had a good year last year, but we were undefeated. Denny Crane, that was us. We have a much higher success rate than the umpires do when it comes to appeals. So I will say that. But it's, now we sit there and we have a DirecTV right next to us. We go to the videotape, which is very, very advantageous to us because we can't see the left field corner from where we sit, which makes it a little bit difficult. You know, if a guy goes in the corner, so we're able to watch it on television. So that makes it a little bit easier.
And if necessary, we can go ask them to show us on their monitors angles that might not have been used in the game broadcast.
I'll be damned if I'm going to do that. They don't pay me enough to do that. We do get paid for it, by the way. Anybody else? Well, if anybody's interested in purchasing a book, they're $35. I take credit cards. I'll sign it and I'll come to your house and read it out loud to you if you want. But thank you for having me, and for you folks, go Sox.